So the emerging compromises that I see happening, or that I see are in the process of happening on some of the key issues, or at least maybe this is wishful thinking. We can keep that for the discussion. Maybe this is actually, in my case, wishful thinking, that I see those things as emerging compromises, but maybe they are not. But you'll tell me. I think that one thing on which there is an emerging compromise is that we need to focus not on institutions as set realities, but really on processes. So this, I think, is increasingly all over the place in institutional theory. And one other way to say that is that we've moved from a preoccupation for institutions as independent variables, so institutions as a bit the black boxes explaining behaviors, interactions, structures, organizational forms, explaining everything in a sense, towards a question of, gosh, but what are those institutions? So institutions becoming the dependent variables. And as soon as you do that, obviously you need to understand things like emergence of institutions, change of institutions, dilution, disappearance of institutions, etc., etc., deinstitutionalization, reinstitutionalization, and therefore you have to have process theories of those things. So that's, I think, one thing where we see more and more agreement that the old 90s, late 80s, 90s story, okay, we have those institutions, they explain what firms do, is not enough, that we need to go in the institution and understand what they are. So all the work on logics, all the work on institutional work, etc., I think really shows this interest and focus on process. Interestingly, though, although I'm full for process, and this is really what I do mostly, ever since the beginning, actually, I've always been interested in processes rather than in institutional impact. There's a question that can be asked fairly, which is how far can we go with this? Because after all, institutions are institutions because they are crystallized, otherwise they're not institutions. So they cannot be seen as totally fluid, because otherwise they're not institutions, they're something else. Okay, so how far can we go into this types of process perspective? That could be an interesting question. As part of this focus on process, we've had huge debates on institutional change, and I think here also we see a certain form of compromise that is emerging. So we've moved beyond the idea that change is essentially this kind of revolutionary type of moment, where suddenly you have a war or a merger and acquisition in the case of a firm, etc., or any kind of strong moment that leads to a disruption and leads to a transformation of organizational practices or institutional patterns. So we've moved beyond that. This certainly is one way in which change and institutional change can happen, but it's not the only way, and we've actually developed theories about forms of institutional change that are more both gradual and consequential,